Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 news. The Ferrari crisis is deepening. Lewis Hamilton talked about multiple issues in the past weekend in Montreal, and that does not seem to be changing going into the Austrian Grand Prix. Hamilton, among many others, have been asking, where are these upgrades? Are they ever going to arrive onto the SF25? Reports have it that yes, that will be true, but again, for some reason, not at the next Grand Prix in Austria in a couple of weekends' time. But that's not because they're abandoning these upgrades and fully focusing on 2026. Apparently, precisely the opposite is currently going on within the team, although that some within the team internally, and honestly, us fans watching from home arguably do not agree with this decision at all. What is happening over there? Hamilton hinted at some serious issues behind the scenes, and the crisis seems to be deepening over the last few days. Where does Fred Vasseur sit in all this? Very much into your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. Well, there's plenty to get into today. I will just quickly say, I've made a couple of videos every day for the last few days. That is not going to continue forever. It's just a lot's happened this weekend, and there's been a lot to talk about. So, you know, I'll do it when I feel like there's news that's worthy of it. Otherwise, it'll be normal service resuming, I imagine, in the relatively near future. But, you know, for now, there's been a lot going on. This is George Russell, just quickly. This is one of the other images of Russell and Max coming out of the steward's room after Russell gave his 45-minute speech on why he actually didn't break the rules, and as we saw the other day, Russell even talked about it, and there was, you know, again, a little bit of, you know, beef really stirring up here, as you might well expect, because George said the whole appeal that they did, the protest that Red Bull did, was just a waste of everyone's time. Now, of course, Mercedes and Russell would say that. He won the Grand Prix anyway. It was eventually dismissed. But he talked about some of the frustrations, right? Because Andrew Chauvelin and Ron Meadows, who had to accompany, you know, Russell to the situation there, they missed their flight that night because obviously it ran too late. It took like 5.5, 6 hours to get the resolution there. And look, it's a small personal frustration. It's not the end of the world for those guys. But I think the point is that many are suggesting is that, okay, whether you think that protest from Red Bull was valid or not, it was thrown out, it took hours to get a resolution, and it's not really been a good look, right? It doesn't look good on the FIA, maybe it doesn't look so good on Red Bull. I think you can argue that whatever you think about Red Bull, their approach, whatever, they do back their drivers to the hilt, and you've got to respect that to some degree, even if the way that they go about it sometimes goes too far. And many would argue, looking at Russell's behaviour, that, look, I don't think a penalty was justified by the rules, but I can understand why people would look at it and say, look, was that a bit unsportsmanlike from Russell if we do believe his intent was to potentially get Max a penalty point on his licence? You know, sure, but as far as I'm concerned, it only adds more drama, baby, and I'm not going to complain about that. But there was some discussion in the media about whether it's necessary to increase the fees to have a protest. Whether you think this is valid or not, like, I'm down for more protests because it's more storylines, but I do understand that it cost €2,000 to put a protest in, which for these teams, of course, is nothing at all, right? Now, I'm really not wanting to suggest that the FIA raise those numbers up, because if they do, it creates another boatload of issues, I think, on the FIA front, which right now is very much under question anyway. But it is, you know, something to consider. The Red Bull were like, well, you know, we can throw a protest in here, whether it comes to anything or not. It's definitely worth our couple of grands to give it a go. And, you know, in the end, it didn't work out for them. And, okay, they have to spend a couple of grand on a nice steak dinner for Ben Sulayem and his boys. But you know what I'm saying, right? So it's something to think about anyway going forwards. Max recognises that, you know what, it wasn't a bad weekend in Montreal. It could have been better. They could have won, but he still gained some points back on Piastri and gained plenty of points back on Lando Norris. Of course, they will need to win more races. But we talked about it going into the weekends. These races, where the softer compounds are in play, the McLaren's advantage does disappear. Now, not to say it disappears entirely, and there are other reasons, I think, why, you know, the McLaren was not quite as strong here as it has been at other Grand Prix weekends. You know, the McLaren's really good in some of the slower speed corners. It's not so good in terms of purely top speed. They have to make some compromises to make that happen. And, you know, that's a pretty big deal around this circuit as well. So it was never going to be on paper McLaren's best circuit, but I think they would have expected more pace. And the reality is that Piastri had a pretty bad weekend, really. although still scored way more points than Lando, which will be Lando's frustration, is that Piastri wasn't really that fast, and it was an ideal opportunity for Lando to capitalise, and, well, we know what happened in both qualifying and the main Grand Prix itself. But I think it shows at least some promise that, I mean, look, if you look at the championship standings, Max is roughly 40 or so points behind Piastri. It's not totally over, and even Russell is only like 60 points back. Like, that's not going to happen. But, you know, who knows? I mean, Mercedes have a rocket ship now and they win everything. Technically, we've got so many rounds to go, right? It's 14 more rounds in the season. this championship is not over yet, but Max says, look, the team's got to step up, and obviously Max will have to execute on that, because during the race, Max was pretty adamant, and I think it was fair that he just didn't have the pace ready to challenge Russell, but he had enough pace to keep Antonelli behind on a good strategy, and the McLarens were very close in pace, but of course couldn't make the overtake happen. Lando was responding to it, of course, last night at the FIA, or the F1 world premiere of the new film. Lando has been asked questions about the weekend and was replying and saying, look, sadly can't change it, got to move on, it is what it is. It was a very interesting weekend, really, because Rosberg made his point, didn't he, after qualifying, when Lando made a couple of errors on his big qualifying laps, again, Q3 when the pressure's on. I mean, like, this is not a random chance situation. Like, there's no coincidence that Lando seems incredibly fast and assured some of the time, but yet when he's starting from pole, like literally the first corner, right? We've seen that happen a few times before when he has issues there. We've seen in moments where the pressure is on, either in Q3 with the best car or in the Grand Prix like we saw on Sunday, things go wrong, right? Like, there's no doubt that this is not a coincidence, right? Like, clearly Lando has issues under those pressure moments, and it's happened to other great athletes in the past as well, and have managed to get over that in various ways. Rosberg was suggesting, look, I'll have a chat with you, like, I'll, do a bit of mental coaching or whatever, and I think probably Norris has to recognise that something like that would be valuable. Whether with Norris or with somebody else, it's a question mark, right? But, like, there's no doubt right now that it's holding Norris back from his potential. And his potential is to be a phenomenal driver. We have seen it. But when the pressure is there, that's when we start to see issues. And it was very evident to many of us at the end of last season when Lando was, getting it on pole. He was doing great qualifying laps, but he was obviously bottling a load of poles to P1, leading the first lap again and again and again. And then as soon as Max locked down and won the championship in Las Vegas, all of a sudden Norris went God mode and the guy was untouchable, right? So, that was probably indicative of some of the stuff that we're going to see this season. And Rosberg says, look, Piastri is now the big favourite to win the title. No doubt about that, but as far as I'm concerned, it's certainly not over yet. It is likely to be one of the McLaren guys, but who knows, right, what could happen over the next couple of rounds. At the end of the day, Max and even George, but certainly Max, are not a million miles behind. The two Ferraris, though, are. They're out of it totally. In the constructors, they were overtaken again by Mercedes this past weekend, and of course in the drivers as well. And people wondering, okay, look, great job, Hamilton, awesome job producing the movie, everything that's going on there. But are the upgrades arriving, right? Like, what are Ferrari going to cook up? And as Denny says, at this point, who knows? No idea when these upgrades are going to arrive, because they exist, right? They're in the pipeline. These Ferrari upgrades we've been talking about for what feels like weeks, if not months at this point. They're ready, I think. They might be being brought this weekend. We thought they were going to bring something for Imola, and then they kept saying, oh no, we believe there's more potential in the balance of the car. We just need to get the balance right and unlock the potential, because Charles Leclerc just went purple in Sector 1. So clearly the car is capable of, winning the championship. It's like, what are we doing here, Ferrari? And maybe as a result of that, or maybe it's a symptom of the problem, Fred Vasseur's Ferrari future remains in serious doubt. There will be heavy scrutiny. At the end of the day, Vasseur's contract at Ferrari runs only for another 6 months. It's relatively rare to see a team principal's contract get run down towards the ends without really any talk of renewal, right? And this is the point. Vasseur's contract is running out in a few months' time. If Ferrari haven't renewed it now, maybe they never will. And we've got even further thoughts from De Kessler and some of the guys in the Italian press to say, yeah, sure, there have been issues at Ferrari before, but they've still come through strongly. Is it true that this team is well put together and well constructed and happy with one another from top to bottom? Right now, I would certainly not argue that feels like the case on the outside. But Hamilton's race was, again, despite, honestly, he had a pretty good race in the circumstances. Like, he wasn't slow particularly. He had a solid qualifying again, but just running into issues all the time. Running over the groundhog, of course, was incredibly unfortunate. Breaking his floor again. Of course, the fact that it happened to the only vegan driver on the grid is, comical in some way, as much as it is pretty sad for the poor groundhog. And they've also extended the Canadian Grand Prix for another 10 years. So, these guys got to move out of Montreal maybe and go to a nearby city. But Hamilton's brake pedal was also having issues. And this, I don't think, was groundhog related, right? But his brake pedal was dangerously long. We heard Hamilton talk about this on the radio, saying, look, I can't brake, guys. This is a big issue. And certainly for Hamilton's style, any issues with the brakes are going to affect his performance. And the brake pedal being long effectively means that you press the brake pedal and it doesn't do anything. You have to push it down a long way before you get any response. And, well, that's certainly a problem. At the end of the day, Hamilton didn't really have to rely so much on the brakes and any of the issues there, because it's not like he was carving through the field making any overtakes. The guy had a very, very lonely race where he was completely in no man's land, not helped by his own team with the strategy they put him on, sticking him in traffic behind Ocon, but also the fact that the pace wasn't strong after the groundhog incident, but he was still faster than the guys behind. So it was a major issue, the brake issues. And the really interesting assessment as well from Auto Racer, that it seems that they've struggled with this long-standing brake issue for years. On a brake-demanding circuit like Montreal, Hamilton had to deal with a long brake pedal for almost the entire race. Leclerc was forced to lift and coast before nearly every corner to reduce his speed ahead of braking. And you could even hear this actually on, trackside, on the run down into turn 10, the hairpin. When Leclerc went past, you could hear him lifting off the throttle, like, before the corner, which was, more than the other drivers were anyway. And that's been an issue for Ferrari. I don't know if there's part of, because there is a part where you run down into turn 10 where the floor can hit the floor, like hit the track. We know that Ferrari have struggled with the plank wear and the ride height and these other things, and there's been a feeling that Ferrari have introduced some lift and coast because it has other benefits, save a bit of fuel, save some of the tyres a little bit. Of course, it slows you down quite dramatically, but it's not enough to necessarily ruin your race. And if you can generate more performance by running the car lower and then do a bit of lift and coast, or even save some of the floor wear, rather than the car running at very high speed, bumping into the floor and, taking risk in that sense, maybe that's an advantage. But it's just pretty confusing what's happening at Ferrari. So this is one piece of the puzzle. But Hamilton, as we know, we talked about it yesterday, was very clear in Montreal, post-Montreal, about the issues behind the scenes at the Scuderia, saying there's a lot going on in the background. I can't say too much about it. I wish I could tell you what's happening. There are things that have happened this year, the problems that we have had. There are so many things I wish I could tell you to explain. So we talked about these quotes yesterday. I'm not going to go into them again in more detail. What I am going to talk about is the consequences of this type of discussion and what Ferrari are currently cooking up for the rest of the season. Because the SF25 has been clear from right at the start of the season, let's be honest, that this is not going to be a championship contending car. They needed big upgrades and fast right at the start of the season if anything was going to change. That never really happens. There have been plenty of problems exposed with the rear ride height and issues with the suspension and effectively fundamental core issues in the car that I don't seem to be able to resolve, and it's putting them really in no man's land at the moment this season. Of course, they will bring some upgrades at some point, we think, but why haven't they done so yet? Hamilton was asked the question in the media pen. It was like, are the upgrades ever arriving? He was even getting interviewed on the bus that they do on the driver's parade. Literally, they came right past us as he was being interviewed, and he was asked the question at the time about, like, what are your upgrades looking like? Is the car much better? And Hamilton was like, what do you mean upgrades, right? We've not got any, and they've not arrived for some reason. What are you yapping about? So they will arrive eventually, but Hamilton was telling the media after the Grand Prix, he was like, I don't really know why we've not brought them yet and when that's going to be happening. And guess what? The Austrian Grand Prix, which is obviously not far from Italy, really, it's okay, Canada, you might not want to bring the upgrades because it's a bit of a trek. Some teams still like to bring them to Canada because they have a bit of time to prepare and all this, but the Austrian Grand Prix, it's not like it's a double header or anything. They have a couple of weeks off, but Ferrari, they're doing it again. I mean, can you believe it? I can, unfortunately, but here we go. Major upgrades are not expected to be brought. The SF25, the characteristics should suit the car better. So only minor changes are expected instead of big updates. Ferrari's management believes the potential seen in simulations is not reflected on track. Now, this is a particularly interesting statement because it's not precisely Fred Vasseur believes, it's Ferrari management, which, is that top brass? Is that John Alcan? Is that Benedetta Vigna? Is that some of the individuals we've talked about over the last few days that's saying, hey, Fred, look, the car says it should be this quick, it's actually this quick, what's going on, right? Are our drivers crap? Clearly not. They're probably the only reason the drivers why the car at least was second for a little time. To what's going on? Are the engineers, like the mechanics, terrible at setting up the car? Or is the simulation simply not correlating to real life? Who knows? But again, it's going to be another weekend in Austria to say, well, yeah, we could bring some upgrades, but actually, no, we're just going to unlock the balance and then the car's going to be rapid. It's like, Who believes that? Who's making these decisions? Where is Vasseur involved? Is he getting puppet mastered from above? Is there a lot of politics going on? Look, it's Ferrari. Of course, there are plenty of politics going on. But it goes from bad to worse as far as I'm concerned, because this also was mentioned in the Motorsport Italy article today that apparently, and again, look, it's Italian press, but the bloodhounds are out, as it were, right? The wolves are here to attack, and this is what we're going to see. Are they going to focus on understanding the car, or are they going to focus on next year's car? Reportedly, they have recalled suspension engineers previously assigned to the Ferrari 678 project, which is next year's 2026 car, and started designing a new rear suspension for the SF25. This decision came late, and due to the time required for design, production and testing, it may not be ready until Silverstone. So this was the talking point a few weeks ago now, that we heard rumours that, Loic Serra wants to, fix the rear suspension. Now look, maybe this is going to prove to be an inspired decision. There is an argument to say next year's car is ground effect as well, at least to some degree. Getting a good understanding of how the rear suspension should behave in combination with the other factors could be critical. And look, the focus of course is on next year. The only reason why you would do this, because let's be real here, Ferrari are not fighting for the championship unless they're literally delusional. I don't think they're literally delusional. So I can only explain this by suggesting that they think that fixing the rear suspension and the learnings they will get from chucking it on this year's car will help them dramatically in terms of developing next year's suspension as well. But it is undoubtedly problematic when you've got a series of engineers working hard on next year's suspension, and then you tell them, actually, hey, we need you to design a new version for this year's car. And they may discover things in designing that new suspension that impact their thinking for next year, which could be beneficial, but also it could waste a lot of their time that they've been working on the 2026 car already, for good or for bad. So it just seems like a bit of a mess. I think that's the way to look at it. Now, there is talk that probably for Silverstone it will arrive, and it is going to be an incredibly crucial moment if that rear suspension improves the performance or not, because, it needs to. And if they can substantially improve that weekend or in the weekends to follow, then it could be an important moment for them and also for the future. But it feels like a strange time when you've got, oh no, our car's actually fine, so we're not bringing upgrades to Austria. But then equally they're like, oh no, actually we do need this new rear suspension because it's going to fix our car. But that's going to arrive late because we've had to take people off working on 2026. I wonder what the drivers think about that, right? Like, is Hamilton on board with this idea? Is Charles on board with this idea? Of kind of taking away some focus from next year's car to stick it back on this year's car? Look, I don't know. Ferrari will do Ferrari things, but it doesn't feel like the decisions that are currently being made are necessarily best aligned. But intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Again, there has therefore been some discussion. I mean, look, here we go. George Russell, Aston Martin. We talked about that earlier today. And for some time now, we've talked about, okay, if Aston Martin want to get involved in the driver market, who could they get? Realistically, it looked like you'd have to go and get Russell, right? If you wanted to try to get some real, top driver. That seemed to be the answer, unless, of course, you could get Max. But with the rumours over the last few days that Leclerc isn't so happy with the way that things have gone at Ferrari, and look, I would think that Leclerc is at least at sometimes going to bed at night and thinking, well, what would the future look like if I wasn't at Ferrari? Could that be something to consider? I'm sure that he's had to think about it at some point. Whether he's going to actually leave, I don't really buy it, but something at least to think about anyway as we talk just quickly about the power rankings to close out the video. So Russell actually got a perfect 10 on the weekends. I mean, he didn't put a foot wrong, qualified on pole, set the fastest lap, won the Grand Prix from the front and managed it well. Of course, there was a pretty controversial instance at the end, but it wasn't punished, so they gave him the perfect 10. Antonelli, I think, did a great job, good defensive driving as well when it was necessary. He got an 8.8. Alonso tied with him. Then Hülkenberg, who had a great drive in the end to score a handful of more points for Sauber. Max, Ocon, Piastri, Behrman, Leclerc, Colapinto. Pretty interesting top 10 in the end, but of course, I suppose one particularly notable absentee. So very much intrigued to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.